Hello, students. Last time we met, we discussed the idea that species evolve, or change over time. We discussed Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's attempts to explain evolution, and how his hypothesis was ultimately shown to be incorrect. This provided the opportunity for another scientist, British naturalist Charles Darwin, to propose his own explanation for how species evolve. In 1831, Darwin sailed with the crew of the HMS Beagle on a trip to explore South America. On this trip, Darwin was able to observe hundreds of species in differing habitats all over the world. Darwin was particularly fascinated by his observations of the plants and animals in a region called the Galapagos Islands. As many of you know, the Galapagos Islands are an island chain that are found off the west coast of South America. If you're looking at your map here, you can locate the west coast of South America. I'm highlighting it here. And then if you go to the west of that, there's right inside this circle there is an island chain called the Galapagos Islands. You can see them in detail here in the inset. There are 13 of them in all. And Darwin was able to visit each one and observe the species that inhabited these islands. One of Darwin's most notable observations was that the species on the Galapagos Islands, like the cacti pictured here, as well as the iguanas and the tortoises and many others, were very different in size, in structure, and in behavior than their counterpart species on the mainland of the South American coast. For example, it's easiest to see with the picture of the tortoises that they're very large and that their structure is very different than what you would typically expect in a mainland tortoise. The cacti as well, although it's harder to tell from this picture, are very tall, very even taller than a person. And so all of the species that Darwin observed on these islands varied significantly from their counterparts, the same kind of species on the mainland. So this made Darwin curious. How did these species become so different from those 1,000 kilometers away on the mainland? It was in the Galapagos Islands that Darwin formulated his historic ideas about how evolution occurs. And the reason that he was able to do this specifically in the Galapagos Islands is because the islands in the Galapagos provide a natural model for how species more generally can become very different from one another. There are two features about the Galapagos Islands that make them an ideal model for studying how species change over time. The first feature is that these islands are geographically separated from one another by vast stretches of oceans. So in other words, it's very difficult to get from one island to the next, and thus, if you're a population of organisms on one island, you are essentially stuck with the environment on that island. The second feature of the Galapagos Islands that makes them ideal for studying how species change over time is that the islands are environmentally diverse. In other words, each of the islands have different weather patterns, different soil types, different level of sun exposure, different vegetation, different predators, and so on. None of the 13 are exactly the same as each other. Okay, so when Darwin visited each of these 13 geographically isolated and environmentally diverse islands, he studied the organisms that lived on each one, and he noticed something very important. He noticed that the organisms differed a little bit depending on which island they were living on. Although he studied many organisms, I'm going to focus on one famous example in particular, which is the example of the finches. So, when Darwin visited each of the 13 islands, he noticed that the finches on each island were different from each other And additionally, they were also different from the mainland finch. We can see this in the diagram. The mainland finch is here in the center. And as you look around the diagram, you see finches that were found on the various islands. And if you compare them, you can see that their beak shapes are different. For instance, up here we see a heavier, more stout beak shape. We can compare it to some of the finches on a second island where you see a thinner beak shape, and here a very small beak. And so not only are they different from each other, but again, all of these beaks are different than the original mainland finch. So Darwin became very curious and motivated to answer this question. What caused the finches on the different islands to have different beak shapes? As an answer to the question of how the finches on each island became different from each other, Darwin proposed the idea of natural selection. And I'm going to highlight this word, this concept here, because this concept of natural selection really is the main point of this section. And the 5 principles I'm about to describe to you are important in understanding exactly how evolution occurs. So do whatever you have to do, highlight or star, so that you know that you really do need to understand each of these principles, because this is how we're going to answer the question of how species evolve. Okay, so we'll start with the first principle, which is within any population, in any environment, there is a struggle for existence. In other words, all the resources that organisms need, like food and water and space, are in short supply. We call these factors that are in short supply environmental pressures, because they put pressure on the population of organisms, causing competition between them. In the pictures to the right, we see 2 examples of this. In the top picture, you'll notice that there's only one food source. And yet there are 2 birds, and so they're going to need to compete over that singular food source. In the second picture, you'll notice that the fish here and here are being chased by the same predator, so they're competing for safe space. So, in both of these scenarios, the birds and the fish are experiencing environmental pressures that cause them to compete with one another. The second principle of natural selection is that variations occur. So, in other words, we know at this point that not all members of a species are identical. Some exhibit variations, which I think I've defined already for you on your slide, but I'll define it here. Variations are inherited traits that make an individual different from other members of its species. So, for example, if we're looking at these 2 birds again, they're very similar to one another, but they do have a variation in their beak shapes. This one's got a very long beak, and this one has a short beak. Down in the second picture, again, the fish are very similar to each other, but there's a variation in color. So this one is lighter green, this one is darker green. So even though they're still the same species, they're not exactly identical. There's variation between them. This leads to the third principle, which is summed up by a phrase you may have heard of before, which is survival of the fittest. What this means is that sometimes certain variations make an organism better suited to its environment. In other words, the variation makes it easier for that organism to outcompete other members of the population, and therefore have a better chance at survival. Any variation that gives an organism a competitive advantage is called an adaptation. In the examples that we looked at before, there are two variations in beak size. We pointed them out already, long and short. However, only one of these variations is adaptive, and that's the long beak. The reason for that is because with the longer beak, this organism is more likely to be able to reach that worm and outcompete its fellow organism for that food source. So the long beak is adaptive, while the short beak is not. The same thing is true down here. Both of the fish colors are variations, but the only one that is adaptive is this one here, because this one allows the fish to camouflage into the reef and therefore be more likely to avoid the predators. This leads us to our fourth principle, which is reproductive advantage. That is, organisms that are adapted to survive are more likely to get the chance to reproduce. As a result, the organism's offspring will inherit the adaptation that made that parent more likely to survive in the first place. In these examples, the long-beaked bird and the dark green fish will, because they have an adaptive variation, they will survive, and therefore they will get the opportunity to reproduce and have long-beaked chicks and dark green fish babies. On the other hand, any organisms that had variations that were not adaptive are less likely to survive and will be less likely to have children to inherit their variations. In this example, no new short-beaked birds and light green fish will be made because their parents' variations were not adaptive. Finally, the fifth principle is called descent with modification. This means that over time, the offspring or descendants, that's where this part descent comes from, it means the descendants, of the individuals with helpful variations will end up making up more of the population. It will modify the population, the general traits of the population, and eventually the population will change so much that they may even become a new separate species. In this example, eventually all the birds in the area will have long beaks, and all the fish will be dark green. All right, so to summarize everything we just said in those 5 principles, if we were going to define this term, natural selection, in a quick one-sentence phrase, we would say that in natural selection, organisms with the traits best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Let's now take a look at how we can apply the 5 principles of natural selection to Darwin's observations in the Galapagos Islands. First, we have the question of why the finches found on each of the different islands had different beak shapes. The answer, according to Darwin, was this idea of natural selection. So let's elaborate. First, we already know that the finches on each island are prevented from moving to a new environment because of the geographic separation between the islands. Remember, there are long stretches of ocean between each island, and so the finches are stuck with the environment that they have. So we have different island environments, each with their own environmental pressures. On each separate island, we have a population of finches, and there will naturally be some beak variations among the finches in each population. Some finches will be lucky and have variations that are better adapted for their particular island environments. The birds that were best adapted for coping with the particular environmental pressures on their specific island would be more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on their favorable traits. In the meantime, the other finches that happen to be on the islands that do not have beak shapes that are adaptive will not be able to compete, and they will become extinct. So that after many generations, each island will only have one type of finch, and that finch should be the type that best matches the island's environment. Okay, so we'll again look at this question of this time how the Galapagos species, like the enormous tortoises and the cacti, became so different from those 1,000 miles away on the South American mainland. And we can see how this pattern is going. Just like before, Darwin would have suggested that the reason that the Galapagos species are so different is, again, because natural selection is causing evolution to occur. He would have said the original population of organisms would have been well adapted to the mainland environment. However, at some point in history, a small portion of the original populations that started on the mainland would have ended up on the various Galapagos Islands. And there are many theories about how this happened. Possibly species drifting over from storms on pieces of driftwood, birds being blown off course, etc. But by some stroke of luck, some of the original populations from the mainland ended up on the Galapagos Islands. And so what we've already seen, I've already discussed, is that the environments on these islands are different from the mainland. So there are now going to be new environmental pressures that are different from the environmental pressures under which the organisms first evolved. With these new environmental pressures, natural selection will occur in the new environments. And over time, the characteristics of the Galapagos organisms will become different enough from their mainland ancestors to cause them to be whole new species. At this point, we say that evolution has occurred. All right, we're going to be finished with this for today. I know that we have a couple more slides, but I want to stop there, and we'll pick this up next time. See you then.